welcome back to another episode of Tech Pro Unicorn Podcast. Today, I am so excited. I have a guest who I've already bonded with. Our first computers were both Commodore 64s. So, that'll give you a little bit of insight into probably our age a little bit. We're both in our 30s. And Commodore 64 is just the bomb of computers. The difference here is my guest Commodore 64 was his original Commodore 64, and it still works, which kind of blows my mind. And sadly, I gave mine away. But I'm joined by Dave Sobel. Dave has been in tech most of his career and now has just evolved into, I'm so jealous. He is the leader of Business of Tech, which is a podcast. We'll talk about it. And also the owner of MSP Radio. He's regarded as a leading expert in the delivery of technology services with broad experience in both technology and business. Owned and operated an IT solution provider and MSP for over a decade, both acquiring other organizations, eventually being acquired. The firm was a winner of multiple awards, including being a finalist for Microsoft's Worldwide Partner of the Year in the Small Business Specialty category. After his MSP experience, he's worked for multiple vendors at such companies such as Level Platforms, GFI, LogicNow, SolarWinds, leading community events, marketing, and product strategies, as well as several other M&A activities. The Business of Tech is both a blog and a podcast, and it's out on YouTube. If you're following along at home and want to check out what we're talking about, if you just go to businessof.tech, which is a really catchy domain name, by the way, Dave. That's very cool how you did that. So Dave Sobel, thank you for taking the time and joining us here on the podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me. And you have already engendered yourself to me on this because you got to add another digit on that. I am in my 40s, not my 30s. So, but you've made me feel great by thinking I'm younger than I am. So I will totally take it.
I love it. I love it. You know, it for somebody with so much just tech experience, it's really cool. We were talking about your journey early on, and you're doing your own thing, which we were talking about being free of the master and not having to like be careful and, you know, dance dangerously and make sure you say the right thing because you're in this company or that company. You get to be kind of a free spirit, looking at the world of technology, which is ever changing as it has been. How cool is that?
Well, I love it, but I'm also open and honest about what it also is. It's also a deficiency of me in that I don't play well in those structured organizations, and that's its own talent. And actually, I have a lot of respect for people that can do that can pull massive numbers of people together and collaborate and produce really incredibly large things. I don't have that skill. That's actually a failing on my part. So I'm channeling the things that I'm not great at into the areas that I can be good at, and trying to say, like, look, I can go and try and look at problems differently. That's what's made me a kind of a free thinker, because I don't fit in that rigidity. But I hope that people take those ideas and then systemize them, process them, do something with them, and make something great out of that. I always laugh and go, like, if you've heard something on my show and then go off and do something amazing in your business, I'm so excited by that.
I love it. You know, coming with all your experience in the IT services space, right? I rail on vendors right now. That's my current like platform. I think vendors do a disservice to the IT market because they put a lot of questionable truths out there, right? Like, we can do it. I can do anything. What's your problem? Whatever it is. And they only sell one widget, right? But they're like, this widget will solve all problems. And I'm like, dude, that's just not helpful, right? Like, knock it off. There's lots of people in the IT services space. What's kind of like the current state of affairs in that space?
Well, so I really try and be analytical about what we see. So you say something about vendors, right? And I look at the vendor space. I don't report a lot on the show particularly, except for certain stories, because I'm always trying to look and say, well, what's the financial incentives behind what's going on?
Yeah.
And I feel like the pushback in vendor has been because a lot of MSPs have not recognized the change from sort of two founder-led organizations working together to the new world of larger types of capital from, particularly venture capital or private equity or those kinds of who have different financial incentives. In a lot of the vendors that we talk about, they used to be founder-led. They have a particular personality and style based on that. These companies have matured differently. Now they have different leadership with different financial incentives. That's not good or bad. It just is. It's a period. We have to recognize that. And then we, the business owners over on this, and those of us that look at the IT services side, need to understand, all right, I've got to understand these motivations in order to align myself in the right way, make the right moves, and make sure that I'm doing the things that are right for my business. And it may not naturally fall into alignment because two founder-led organizations just kind of naturally fall into a rhythm because they feel very differently, or very similarly. But when it gets complicated, that's when it's different. And so for me, like if you're asking me like the big trend around this, it's that look, there's a lot more kinds of capital and a lot more kinds of leadership in the IT services space, and we've got to be a lot more analytical about analyzing who we're working with.
All right. I love that perspective. I mean, I really kind of felt like, oh, I have to understand their motives, right, and their drivers, and my drivers, right, and then just like in relationships, right. I mean, you're really starting to dance.
Well,
A
to
little
be
bit.
fair, it's always been true. It just was easier when
Yeah.
they were really similar, just naturally. Particularly when, I mean, if we think, I got into managed services as a space in kind of sort of 2002, right? And if I think about some of the big players in the space, your ConnectWises, your Datos, your Kaseya, like they were all founder led, right? So they were all founder led organizations who were also trying to grow. And so I'm a founder led organization. They're a founder led organization. We have a lot more private control over things. The only people I really have to satisfy are the internal leaders and the owner. They probably have, maybe some angel investors or some family and friends, but they're not that different from me. So I don't have to ask as many questions. But by the way, if you look back at that time, Microsoft during that time frame was a partner that we always were questioning. They're a big public company, and we always had to sit around thinking about that now. And what's happened now is we've got a bunch of companies that look a lot more like Microsoft than they do look like me. That's okay, right? It's I'm not placing judgment here. It's just harder. Like it's just a more complex thing. Oh, and by the way, let's layer on the trend of the cloud, where we have so many more vendors. None of these IT trends make anything actually simpler. We talk about it making it simpler, but it actually makes things way more complicated. And you've got way more vendors than you've ever had before, and now you've got to do all this analysis of them and their financial motives and where they're going and what business layer they play in and all that kind of stuff. It's like, oh, I get it. That's why this space is hard. That's why it is way harder than it's ever been.
I appreciate the fact that you recognize that it's complicated, right? I think to me, I've always said that, right? You're creating these hybrid environments and such, and it creates a complexity, right? In both operations and who does what and who's zooming who and what layer is causing issues and what layer is not. And I feel like some companies handle it well. You're seeing a lot of companies create CTO positions, which are different than CIOs, and they have a CIO and a CTO, and the CIO focuses on what's the business need and the relationships and such, and the CTO is like, let me go figure out all these layers, right? All this complexity, and is way more on the tech side than perhaps the CIOs. And the companies that don't do that seem to hit some speed bumps along the way, because it does introduce a huge layer of complexity into the traditional kind of IT application layers.
Yeah, I just actually had on a CTO. He runs his podcast is the CTO podcast, right? And he talks, he interviews CTOs, and he's a former CTO himself. And actually, the question I asked him was, "Do you think MSPs can do this job? Like, can you? What about the virtual CTO?" And it was a really fascinating conversation because we broke down what the CTO was, and his initial reaction was, "Well, you can't really outsource that." And then as we dug into it, it's like, well, maybe you can, and maybe you can outsource parts of it, and maybe you have to understand different bits, but it's a very different skill set than many often have now. And for me, that's the interesting piece of exploring this stuff. I'm doing what I'm doing literally for the reason that you sort of laid out, is this is hard. And I look around too much, and I hear too many people talking about how amazing this all is and how much opportunity there is everywhere, and you'll just trip over your own shoes if you're not like printing money on the latest opportunity. And it's like, well, this is actually really hard. And let's have an honest conversation about the challenges.
Amen.
Because if we do, we'll actually get better at this. And our space has a lot more challenge. I've talked almost too much at times about cybersecurity, not because everyone's talking about cybersecurity and it becomes one of two things. It's like, well, there's this amazing, there's incredible threat. And then the immediate next breath from most people is, and there's an opportunity to make so much money. And I look and I go, you realize this is like really bad for our customers, right? Like spending their money on cybersecurity is not actually growing their business. It's not actually a really good use of their money. Don't get me wrong. I think we have to do it. I think it would be, wrong of us to ignore the real threat in the world. But let's not spend a bunch of time celebrating this. It's kind of bad that we have to do all of this work to fend off criminal mafia organizations that are stealing our money. Like this isn't good. And by the way, it looks kind of icky when you're talking about it in that terms. Like, I'm off to make so much money on cyber. That feels really gross to me. Let's talk about it in much more realistic terms. And by the way, I think our customers will appreciate it if we do that. Like, if we're actually honest about, like, look, this is the threat. Let's talk through the threat. Let's understand it. We'll do a good risk analysis for you. But you should understand, like, there's real criminals, like organized crime, Tony Soprano style, out there to get you. And I'm going to profile them for you. And by the way, there's nation states too. Literally just did a story on the show about North Korea explicitly building programs to steal money from small businesses. Why? Well, they've got a arms race that they want to pour money into. So they've decided the way they're going to raise money is targeting small businesses. Okay, well, that's a thing. That's a real thing.
Wow.
Let's talk through that. Let's talk through that. Right? It's a real threat. We have ways of addressing this. There's security implementation we do, but by the way, let's not celebrate it.
Yeah.
So I'm with you. It's like, this is complicated. This stuff is hard. Let's have conversations about the difficulty and not paint that everything is amazing.
I love that. I really appreciate that. The continuing into the complexity aspect, then we get government regulation, right? That feels the need to wade in because the tech companies are too big and they're making too much money and there's too much monopoly and there's too much whatever it is they feel somehow us in the tech space are not doing correctly and these folks that, quite honestly, it's amazing they can turn on their computers in the morning, wade into the tech space and want to control this and want to protect everyone and offer value. What's happening with the latest of regulations? I think what you see hit the headline is Mark Zuckerberg in front of the Congress, which is a little different than what's happening in the regulation space around tech. But they are trying to control various aspects of tech and security and privacy kind of all the time. And you seem to have just a great pulse on all of that. What's the latest?
Yeah, so I want to take a quick step back because I actually have a much more positive view of the system of government that's at work working on this. And let me observe for you. So Senator Mark Warner from my home state of Virginia is the lead voice on cybersecurity. Like, he built Nextel, everybody. Like, he's not. This is not a guy who is like completely oblivious to the space. And don't get me wrong. I think there's been a lot of hearings where politicians will showboat for the cameras, but I think that's more a judgment on media than it is a judgment necessarily on all of their capabilities. And by the way, we've got there's a lot of organizations, particularly the CISA, our Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, like, that are helmed by real professionals that know their stuff. I've been talking to people at the FBI who are really good at this. Like, they really understand this. So there's this kind of caricature of government that says, like, oh, they don't know anything. It's a lot more complicated than that, everybody. And by the way, I like to simplify the regulation conversation with a quick anecdote. Like, if you and I went into business right now owning a chemical processing plant, the cheapest way to get rid of our waste would be to dump it into the river next to our plant. Like, that really would just legitimately be the cheapest way to get rid of our waste, right? Dump it in the river, make it go away. Now, society, you and I have decided we like to drink clean water. So we've made that illegal. You cannot just dump your waste into the water. Now, we can have a very legitimate debate about what particles per million is clean versus not clean. That, everybody, is called politics and regulation, is the debate over expertise and understanding and balancing stuff. But I think we don't want those chemicals dumped in the water. And when we think about, now I'm relating this to data privacy, like, I don't think we want just anybody being able to do anything with our data at any particular time without any controls of any kind. That seems kind of bad to me. Right?
Good point.
So we can have now we get into, now we can have some, well, we framed it, we can have some intelligent decisions about the ups and downs about this. And I have been shouting from the rooftop saying, I think IT services companies need to be more involved here, because you've got the expertise and you are a contributing factor in the process. And if that means working with your local politicians, at the state level, at the local level, or your representation in Congress, I think this is important that your voice be part of that, because you understand that. Now, to the larger sense, there's a bunch of things going on right now. From a data privacy perspective, there's a bill working its way through Congress. We'll see if it can pass. The Europeans have already moved in this space, and they're moving even further on other levels of regulation. Why do we care? Catchphrase from my show all the time. Well, we care because a lot of these companies are international. You look at a company like Microsoft or Google, who is managing a large portion of our data. If they're doing business in the US and they're doing business in the EU, they're going to try and maximize the system to take care of things in most cases. And so they're probably going to build a system towards EU regulation if it's a little bit more strong. But by the way, if we're Americans, we may not get the benefits of that, but we're going to get the downside of it. Maybe we should get the benefits too by having our own corresponding law. On a local IT services level, like, we're being the industry is made aware of us, particularly when we look at it from a cyber threat perspective. And government, regulators are looking at this space and saying, hey, we have to help small businesses not get ravaged. I alluded to earlier, like, the North Koreans are specifically targeting us. We could get into, like, Russian protected mafia organizations, just from a criminal organization. We've got it, from China as well. Like, we see all of these threats. Our leaders are generally in the business of protecting the American economy. That's what we've elected them to do. What is the easiest way that it's bipartisan support? Protect small business. Right? And some of these legislators have actually started seeing that doing stuff matters. In Louisiana, I covered on the show that they now, any MSP that does business with any government in Louisiana has to register with the state, with the Secretary of State, and has to do 24-hour disclosure of any breach. That's very, it is specific, right? It is any MSP that works with a government, so you have to be in public sector there.
Yeah.
But I covered that 2 summers ago on the show. I just covered that same Secretary of State and his Chief Information Officer promoting the policy as a big success at the Conference of Secretaries of State. What do politicians love doing? Sharing good ideas. And they're touting that this law has helped them be much more coordinated about responding to threats at the government level. And other secretaries of states are going to look and go, that one works. We should borrow that idea.
Right.
So it's we can see it at all different levels. There's a lot of stuff going on. By the way, I always end up having to do a piece on legislation at some level, generally every week on the show, because there's enough working its way through that we want to track all this stuff. And by the way, that's me trying to look broadly at the trends, much less what's happening in your own local governments.
I really like For those of you following along at home on businessof.tech, like you have just a really cool kind of how you've parsed up your information. Like you can go to regulation, you can go to security, right? The things that we're talking about. And there is information and articles and your latest blog posts. And sometimes when people are like, I'm a podcast host or I'm a blog, and you go and it's like they haven't posted in 6 months, or they post once every, whatever. Like we were joking before, like all Dave does really is bring this content to the audience, and it's timely. Like there's stuff every day, right? Sometimes twice a day. I'm looking, and there's July 18th. You posted a couple times. You're really staying abreast of it, which is cool, right? Which is part of the battle on security. Security is not set it and forget it, or I bought a product and now I'm safe. Because that security landscape on the other end, the bad actors, the bad guys, they're constantly, this didn't work, great. Now let's try this. Now let's try this, right? The threat is ever changing, both geographically, organizationally, and in the actual technology threat itself. It's crazy.
And they're good at it. They are really good at it. I mean, one of the things that I talk a lot about is these ways of talking about it differently. Like thematically, I think we're using the wrong words. Oftentimes, we too much focus on victim blaming versus looking on the adversaries, and I don't think we have enough respect for the adversary. Oftentimes, they're either very much abstracted, an attacker, like it's just some vague sense, or we have this thought of, well, it's just some guy in his basement or a script kiddie, or this is easy to do. It's like, have you dug into them? These are this is a multi-layered level of threat. Like we could talk nation state. Do you want to get into the arms dealing that's going on as all of different countries start looking at their different moves? We could go to that level, or we could have a really fascinating conversation about the mafia style criminal organizations, which are run like businesses. Mm-hmm. If not for being illegal, it's a freaking awesome business. I'm so impressed by them. They have shift work. They punch in, they punch out. They have benefits. They have HR departments. They have customer service departments for their victims. So your grandma, you don't know how to pay in Bitcoin? They'll walk you through that. And they are better at customer service than organizations commercially that focus on customer service. They've got a finance group. They have PR groups. They publish their financial statements so that they can actually recruit new affiliates. Because, by the way, they've got a partner network, and they've divided it up. So they've got dev teams working on the payloads. They have those, refinement of that. They do QA and testing. They then have a sales group like affiliates that get. It is so impressive and so well run, and we do not, I think, give them enough credit and respect as adversaries. Like if you think this through, you want to understand their moves so that you can have these smarter, very concrete discussions. And if I make it really tangible to the small MSPs and IT services companies that are listening, think about the way you talk to your customer. If you're talking about it in an abstract term of, well, we've got to protect you from threats and we need to make sure your business is secure. Like, no one has an emotional connection to that. And by the way, that's how people buy. But if I sit down and go, let's talk about the threat. I've been watching, we're tracking 16 to 17 different ransomware groups. They've been very targeted. We now know the North Koreans are coming for small businesses. This is what they are explicitly trying to steal revenue from you. That is the goal. They know that they can do this systematically and they can steal revenue. If they can pull 1 to 3% of all their victims pay out, that's a really great payout for them. So we've got to make it like, if you talk in very concrete terms,
right,
it's very relatable, and people will respond differently than these abstract ideas. And by the way, we need to talk about this on an ongoing basis.
I love it. It's a better way, right? If you can create that visualization, just the two conversations that you just had, right? People are like, oh, yeah, North Korea bad, and they just like go through this basic like, oh, yeah, I do need something. I spent a bunch of time in healthcare, right? And you talk about like unfortunate spending, right? Healthcare can either spend money on serving patients in need, or they can build a IT security organization because they have to. And then when there are breaches, right, and it's not when, or it's not if you will be breached, it's when you will be breached, right? And then the world's like, I can't believe that happened. You can't believe that some little podunk hospital with 4 people in their IT services security department couldn't fend off the mafia of Russia. Like, that doesn't make sense to you. Like, and then you want them to pay bazillions of dollars of fines, which is, oh, by the way, just taking money away from the patient care in the state in which you live and get services from. Are you crazy? Like, do you think that they just weren't trying? Like, but it's just
Well,
such a
let's also be clear that in some cases, people are not even trying.
true.
And I think we also need to sort of separate this out of kind of competence versus incompetence. Like I'm with
Mm,
you in that I don't want to penalize those that have done due diligence, but I'm literally digging into numbers where the adoption of multi-factor authentication is just abysmal. Like it's just so bad.
right.
And but if I talk to people about do you lock your car? Well, of course I lock my car. So you don't want keys to your computers that have like way more valuable stuff on them? Well, I hadn't thought about it that way. Well, yeah, that's because we talk about it in this very abstract term. Yeah, I get it. None of us really love having to type in that extra number. But you know what I like less? Losing all my money. I like that a lot less. And I want you to think every single day when you're typing that number in that I am making sure that very described attackers, gangsters, mobsters, criminals, not vague attackers who are specifically targeting us are doing it. I love this other description that I say. I want you to think about it in this terms. Gangs of criminals are roaming in public across streets of America with armed weapons, and they are taking hostages. Everything I just said is true. It's just happening virtually.
Mm,
And it's happening so many times every single day. And yet our reaction is nearly nothing. The words matter. The way we talk about it really matters.
I love it. Yeah. I mean, you just paint vivid pictures, right? You create this vision, and then you're just motivated. Like, how do we stop this,
How
right?
do we stop this?
Yeah.
And by the way, there's lots of things we need to do. Like there's all
Yeah.
the way from we need to employ our government to be taking action and not allowing other countries to protect criminals. This is now becoming part of our diplomatic efforts. By the way, most people don't know this. Did you know the State Department now has an entire group dedicated to cyber? Because this is now part of international diplomacy. That should be applauded, right? That's our government, the State Department, who manage diplomacy all over the world
Hmm.
and are generally pretty good at their jobs. They're out there now taking this seriously. We've been funding, we're funding efforts around cyber defense. We are now, we are looking at all of those capabilities, but we also need to do it. Let's take in local levels. Like, are we funding the law enforcement at the level that we need to? Are we educating them?
Yeah.
And on the private side, like, do you know how to deal with this? Are you prepared? Do you have a relationship with your FBI field office?
Hmm.
Most providers blink when I say that. Like,
Yeah.
but by the way, did you know they have a whole team at every field office devoted specifically to this that are ready to go, that you can have a relationship beforehand, before you need them? This is all elements that you providers need to get into. And by the way, everything I've just described, just to understand, this is actual premium service. Like, this is the kind of service that customers
Hmm.
want, will embrace, will do something with. I am a good capitalist at heart. I just want to make sure that we're not viewing this is not some massive opportunity. This is something that we all have to address. We have our part to play as players in society. We work together on it.
I love it. I used to tell people, like, our parents tell stories about they grew up and they used to never lock their doors on their house, right? They just, that was nirvana that they lived in. And I was like, do you lock your doors? Everyone's like, yeah, we lock our doors. Right. Same concept, right? The world has unfortunately changed a little bit, and you lock your doors. your parents didn't lock your doors, right? Um, I want to talk a little bit about ethics because that's something else that's getting a lot of airplay, and the ethical responsibilities and such. And big companies now have ethics departments, right? Which were at first, kind of that was like, okay, let's make sure that we're acting ethically. And it's grown into almost a field in and of itself. And then there's big companies that can afford to have this staff and this vision and this advisory. And then there's smaller companies that probably don't have an ethics department, or maybe they have a VP of ethics but what's happening around ethics? It gets a lot of airplay.
Yeah, I mean, so for me, I do like to focus on the fact that small companies have the ability to be very agile and very flexible in the way they do that. And you can actually bake values into an organization a lot easier when you're small.
Love that.
Again, well, let's use some typicals, right? So the typical IT services company, managed services provider, has about 16 staff or so. It's actually pretty easy to get to know your entire team as a leader when you're at that level. And you can actually lead by example. You can invest in the values and live the values in an organization like that very easily. Part of the reason you have to do it at systems at large organizations is just scale. It's really hard to get everyone on the same page. Again, back to my initial opening statements, I have real respect for those people that can do it across thousands of people in an organization. It's really hard. I'm not good at it. but what I do think is possible is the superpower of small organizations is that you can have a very personalized touch. You can very much customize that. And I tend to believe in, I'm kind of old school on certain fundamentals of business. I look at the very basics, right? You got to bring revenue in, you have costs, you have to make money. Like, I think profit is an actual requirement. I'm not into this whole growth at all costs methodology of business. I just don't buy into it. And that's where I think small business can live that. You have to run a business that makes money. But at the same time, maybe, just maybe, you can increase your long-term value by a little bit more investment now in people and in the building the type of culture, because over time that will pay off. Those are the kinds of organizations that have deep relationship with customers, which is particularly important if you're in services. If you're in services, you sell trust much more than anything. And relationships save your bacon every single time. Well, how do you get that? You got to invest in the people that deliver on that. You can't skip. So for me, the ethics discussion is just one of very practical of, let's make it easier for people to do the right thing in organizations by building organizations that are supportive of that.
Focusing on the people that are in tech, we're in this great resignation, or maybe we're coming out of it. Who knows? We went through this period, right, where work from home became the primary versus the secondary. Right, it was a nice to have. In the news recently was Elon saying, "Okay, work from home is over. Everybody back to work, or you're fired." Extreme. Not quite sure it's effective. We'll see how that plays out. What's happening with the world of hybrid work, right? Because a lot of people are like, I like working from home. A lot of people are like, I hate working from home, right? I want a hybrid environment. I want to go into the office if I can. I want to stay at home. Some people are like, I want to stay at home. I want to live in an RV. I want to live on the beach in Mexico. Like, what is going on?
I am fascinated by this space. So, by the way, let me just call out Elon for a moment, because that's a fun one, right?
So Elon, easy.
Elon comes out and says, hey, you got to get into the office, you're fired. You know what Elon also said? He's concerned about the economy and he may have to trim staff. What's the easiest way to get people to self-volunteer to leave your organization? Say stuff like that, and certain people are going to quit. It could be a very considered move to get some people to quit, because, by the way, I think he's a bad manager. I mean, it's just become very clear that he's a bad manager.
Oh, yeah.
What's an easy way to get some of those people to leave? Say something like that, and you don't have to fire them, and you don't have to pay severance. So you always have to look at the financial motivations of these players of what they're doing. I think the move back to the office is generally a symptom of bad management. I get it. It's actually more difficult to focus on work product than on time. And what's the easiest way to measure time? See everybody and walk around the office like a Bill Lumbergh out of Office Space, right? Like that's actually, think Lumbergh as the worst manager who just would patrol and was viewed as a manager. That's the easiest way to do it. And what's the easiest way to do it? Put everybody in the office. Now, I want to take a quick step back and talk about what I actually think is happening, because I don't think in business we talk enough about the larger elements of what's going on collectively. And if we think about the world and the American economy in particular, collectively, American society is going through a great trauma. The COVID-19 caused great upheaval in our society. It made a lot of people very frightened. More than 1 million people died. Like that is traumatic to a society. And during that time, during those pressures, a lot of people took stock of what's important to them. Family, friends, their relationships, the number one thing. And in business, too often we don't talk about people as people. We talk about them more as cogs in the org versus what they're looking for. What are people looking for? They're looking for a better life. That's what they're trying to do, is they want to support their family or their friends or whatever their personal goals are. And they are taking stock of what's happening. Why are they resigning? A lot of people are figuring out that there are other options. That trauma is often a great time to shake things up. You're already disoriented, discombobulated. You're ready to make a new decision. So a lot of employees are looking at it that way. And by the way, they're looking around. If you see it at the entry level in jobs, they're finding that some of those bad jobs, they could get other bad jobs that are less bad. Right, that pay the same, that have less difficult conditions. It's why they're having a difficult time finding people in like food service and waiters. Like people can go, I can go make the same amount of money in an office, right, or doing something entry level, and that's the disruption we're having broadly. I think for us in technology, the bigger opportunity is to look at the conversion from time to deliverable. We talk a lot, like particularly in managed services, about actually like this idea of delivering of the service versus on time. But how many of us all freak out about every timesheet on every managed services organization all the time? You're still measuring time, everybody. You haven't actually moved to work product. I get it. This is hard. Managing to work product is scary. You have to put a lot of trust in your people. You have to, but that gives people the empowerment to be more productive and do things that make more sense. I think this whole hybrid thing is silly. People are saying, well, be in the office 2 days, out of the office 3. What's the difference between the other way around? What's the difference between 4 and 1? It's all arbitrary lines. You're not making any determination based on what makes sense for work. I do agree there are certain types of things that feel better in person. There's a lot of others that don't. And by the way, different people work different ways. I'm quite good remote. I really am good at collaborating and whiteboarding and brainstorming and being very productive remote. But not everyone's like that. And we need to create spaces that make people empowered to do the things that are right for them. This is harder. I get it. But I tend to think there's reasons why I like tech services companies to do this. The first is this is technology enabled. You need tech to do this thing, to do this well. You need systems, you need processes, you need the technology. So I think IT services companies are really well positioned to do this. And then the second bit is this is very valuable. You can get into business process and the way you and your customers work, and you can help make changes there. And that's valuable. That's the kind of stuff that people pay good money for. Everyone's looking for the one solution. It isn't that. It's actually going to be customized and delivered for each org that plays off their strengths and their capabilities and what they do and what works for them. And they're going to build a great organization that works for them. And being involved with that is going to be really incredible.
I love so much of that, especially the customization, right? I think we so often get sold or think of things as one size fits all. And it really is what works best for your team, right? For your company, for your business model, for your, we use, I'm a big fan at digital whiteboards, right? We use a company called Vibe. I love my vibe board, right? Everybody who knows me knows I vibe. It's became a verb, right? Oh, Michael's going to vibe this, right? Because that's now how I think. I think on this digital whiteboard because it's amazing, right? I can call it up, I can present it, I can PDF it, I can do everything with it, and it's always there, right? I can access it on every machine. It's just amazing, um, and it works for me, right? Everyone finding something that kind of works for them. I use wireless mics, I use follow cams, so my customers say it's like you're here, right? And I don't have to be, and I just saved you $3,000 in travel costs and saved me a disruption from being away from my family, right? I get to pet my dog in the morning, come and do this amazing presentation, go home, feed my dog. Um,
But I also don't want to dismiss the skills element of what you've just talked about. And embedded in everything you just said, you were talking about the tech, but it's also the way you use those to
mm,
deliver the solution. And that actually is the higher value stuff, right? It's not just the I have this cool piece of tech. It's that I know how to integrate it into the way I present, and I will change potentially the style of
mm,
presentation and the way that I talk. And anybody who's worked virtually knows that there are literal differences to the way you present, and that you have to be a little bit more amplified, and you have to be much more dramatic across the differences. Like I will go much lower intentionally, and then I'll go bigger, much intentionally. But that's by choice because it's actually harder to
yeah,
do this online, and it's a taught skill. And by the way, those that teach it will do very well because they will be helping others be very, but it's that enablement piece that I'm so excited by. And I love customization. Oftentimes, and I'm a little, again, I'll be old school. People are just derivative of consulting as like a word. Consulting is I'm literally designing things specifically for you. It is custom tailored, it is bespoke, it is like a suit that fits you perfectly. And that is very high value. I like high value.
I love it. Um, we could just keep going, literally. I found my kindred spirit here in Dave. Uh, I really appreciate, all of you. First, what you're doing, right? I think you're just in a unique position to be having your experience, being able to connect to everything that's kind of happening in the world of business and technology, and then bringing that along with some thoughtful opinion um, in the business of tech, bringing that kind of to the world. That's a gift to us, and I just really sincerely appreciate you doing that. I think you raise the conversation that we need to have. I love your analogies around security and kind of the visualization that makes it real to create action, to create security. Um, Thank you for what you're doing and for taking the time and from one big podcast to a small podcast over here. Thanks for taking the time and joining me, and just a great discussion. I really enjoyed it.
Well, this has been great fun. And I say all the time, like I put out opinions not to be right, but for the idea of if of analysis and understanding why I think the things that I do. And I immediately always tell somebody, if you think something different than me, go out in the marketplace and prove a better idea works better, and I will applaud it because I don't think there's only one answer. And so it's okay to talk about these things and know that I'm throwing out ideas and I'm wrong sometimes. I get them wrong. But I'm throwing them out there because I want you to think about it and come up with your own. So thanks for having me. This has been great fun.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave.